Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. I consider it a great personal honor today to welcome Dr. Greg Cootsona as our guest on Conversing. Greg and I have known each other for decades, and I have always had the deepest admiration and gratitude for who he has been as a friend and also as a partner in ministry and a partner in thought at a complicated time in American history and in global history. He's been a serious conversation partner who takes the life of the mind, life in the world, life in relationship to the most vulnerable with great compassion and seriousness. And our friendship over the years has helped to make me, in part, who I am. His work has been both as a Presbyterian pastor in the PCUSA denomination, but also as a faculty member in comparative religion and humanities at California State University, Chico. He has worked collegially and successfully alongside colleagues in other faith traditions in that academic setting and in others as well. He's had a great interest over the decades in science and faith. This emerged during his time as a student at the University of California, Berkeley, and has been sustained throughout all of his academic life and his professional life as well. He's led various enterprises funded by the Templeton Foundation, such as Science for the Church and Faith and Science for Emerging Young Adults. It's Greg's current role that brings him into the conversation today. He's recently been appointed the executive director of AI and Faith, an organization founded a number of years ago in the Northwest, but now in its next chapter has hired Greg as its first executive director and the one who's going to lead into the second chapter of this global organization that has already collected a wide array of scholars to ask some of the most important and serious questions about AI and faith. Greg Cootsona, welcome to Conversing. It's such an honor and a joy to have you.
Well, it is such a pleasure to have this conversation.
You know, Greg, we've known each other for decades, and your life has affected mine in many, many ways, more ways than I could name on this occasion. But I do want to just say that the convergence of the things that I've known and seen about you in the past seem to me to have found a new chapter of your life and your professional work, but a convergence that seems to me to be one of exceptional capacity and potential. So I'm very excited to explore the work that you're doing with AI and faith. But before we get to that, let's step back a little bit. I'd like you to just sketch the background of work and ministry and education that you've been doing for many years that has somehow all come together now in this new occupation and context.
Well, I think it goes back to my birth in Palo Alto, California, the now epicenter of the Silicon Valley. Although neither was Palo Alto or Menlo Park, where I lived, a part of the Silicon Valley, nor was it called the Silicon Valley yet. That was the air I breathed. And in thinking about this, I've realized that there really is this gospel of Silicon Valley, which comes with an affirmation. You among mortals are chosen to solve every problem effectively and efficiently.
Right. That's the gospel.
That is the gospel.
It's like when I interviewed the president of Caltech and I asked him to tell me what he thought the mission of Caltech was. And he said, to permanently change knowledge.
Small task.
A small aspiration. And likewise, Silicon Valley has never been lacking in great aspirations. So you're formed in this environment where all kinds of things are going on, apparently in garages that no one would have guessed. We're going to change the world. And that unfolds through the years of your childhood. And when do you first become aware of this, of the specialness of the place that you were living in that technological sense?
I didn't really take in that it was only about 5 miles from my house in Menlo Park that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak developed the first personal computer. But it was sometime, around that, mid 70s that I began to realize that something special was happening in technology in the Bay Area. So, already places like Hewlett Packard and Varian Associates and others were in that region, but we didn't quite have it down, that this was a place where, well, we couldn't predict what was going to happen, but it was already something that was, I think, in the air. And I think along with that was we can solve a problem if we just work the tech and the science hard enough, Mark, can I just give one personal example from
Sure,
my
please.
home, which I think is the way that I understand the way I was formed, is that my dad, whom you knew, of course, was an engineer, and he loved to help us see how things worked. And so he never liked those original Coke glasses, smaller at the bottom, bigger at the top. And he'd say to my brother and me, Marcus and Greg, those glasses have a high center of gravity. They're far too unstable. And my dad was a really fun person, but he also loved to help us understand how things worked. And I think that kind of approach, and he was an engineer, was something that I took in. And it's the approach that said, we can solve a problem. We don't really need some transcendental, reference for solving that problem.
And yet you go to Cal out of that background of human capacity to resolve problems, to make a new world, etc. You land at the University of California, Berkeley, and not long after you're there, your life takes a new set of changes because of how your faith develops. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, sometimes I put this in as a punchline to a joke, or that it sounds like a punchline. I grew up in this family that's non-religious, even in some ways, tips anti-religious. I go to Cal and become a Christian.
Right.
That sounds like, which of those elements does not fit in this triad?
It's an oxymoron.
But that is the story. And of course, you were a big part of it because you were the pastor at First Press, the college pastor, and you saw that you saw that develop. I say that with a little bit of a laugh because there's always that you saw it, the gangly adolescent version of that develop as well.
It was a great season. As that happens, so you grow up in this really materialist sort of vision of the world from your home, and really the ethos, I would say, of Menlo Park and Stanford and that life on the peninsula, which continues to this day. And then there's this hunger inside you that was part of this spiritual quest. So where did that come from as you look back on it? Had that been quiet for years and looking for a manifestation, or was it more like you were looking in a new direction than you ever had before?
I think I'd always looked for meaning and love, at some deeper level. And I'd been fairly fulfilled at some level also in the hometown that I grew up in, and I had a good family and good friends. But I think as I was plucked from that town and placed in a much more pluralistic, somewhat postmodern city of Berkeley, and I was asking these questions, which are, a part of, late adolescence, that was, all of a sudden I didn't have the answers. And it added to that, I was, I'd run into the writings of C.S. Lewis, who raised those issues. And he was so reasonable and wise about the way he responded to the issues of meaning and love that I couldn't disregard it. And just with friends and then with doing some of my own study, it all bound up into what is often called existential angst, which I love as a generalized phrase, but personally it was actually pretty unnerving. And that's what happened that first year at Berkeley, as I was trying to add up this search for love and meaning, the writings from different religions I was studying in the classroom, the reading I was having in the Bible, this encounter with Jesus that was emerging from the New Testament. And I found that I just didn't really have the answers. And in the gospel, that's where they found resolution.
And in the gift of having Earl Palmer as the pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley at that time, you had one of C.S. Lewis's most enthusiastic interpreters, but you also had somebody who loved preaching from the Bible and especially from the Gospels, and helped, I think, to help bring about coherence across this waterfront of ideas and new experiences that were unfolding. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, Earl's preaching was very powerful for me. And there's a phrase that I often resonates for me, which comes from his exposition of the first chapter of the book of Philippians, where Paul is hearing about all these other people that are noising about the gospel and saying bad things about Paul. And Paul says, what then? At least Christ is officially proclaimed. And Earl brought out of that something that I think is really important for actually what we're talking about today. He said, the gospel is not fragile, and it grows best in situations that are not ideal and conditions that are not ideal. And so I think that's where, as I then started to face the narrative of, Western culture's gone beyond religion that I heard so often at Cal, that I was able to come with a confidence in the gospel.
Right, right. So then you graduate from Cal and you get married, and life begins to unfold in wonderful ways. You decide to go to graduate school. And by that stage, you're on the road to going to seminary. After you've worked for your family and done some other things, then you eventually land at Princeton Seminary. And you eventually go on and get your PhD through the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley. And those take you in directions that are an interesting combination of interests, both faith and, in your case, particularly science. So tell us about that journey. What was that about for you?
Yeah. So after those years in retail, where I was reading, theological texts when the customers weren't there, and Laura, my wife, is saying, maybe you should go pursue this a little further, which of course I did, as you mentioned. And one of the first classes I had at Princeton in philosophy was, one of the first parts of that class was engaging with scientific methods and how they relate to theological methods. And I thought to myself, I wonder why this is happening. Not that I hadn't encountered some of the challenges of science and some of the promises too, don't get me wrong, but I was seeing that there was a need to really encounter this scientific and technological world that we are involved in. I focused primarily on biblical studies aside from the pastoral training at Princeton. So that was where I really wanted to get grounded in the New Testament particularly. And then I did this year of study at the universities of Tübingen and in Heidelberg, where I looked at Karl Barth, the great Reformed theologian, and Alfred North Whitehead, the mathematician and philosopher, and how they both understood God and the world. And then when I came back to the Graduate Theological Union, I brought that project and how these two were a type of seeing, life from above and from below. And so Whitehead bringing the insights of science and of, rational reflection, you might say, from below, and Barth with his theology of the word coming from above, and putting those into conversation really began a lot of this academic engagement with science, technology, and religion. I should also add that I had these great advisors at the GTU, Robert John Russell, Bob Russell, and then Ted Peters. And Bob, was a trained PhD in quantum physics. And I'll never forget, with some of those early lectures where he'd tell us about, time dilation and special relativity and how that related to the doctrine of creation. So I was getting tutored, as it were, by great people in the field and bringing it to this theological and philosophical reflection.
Well, the riches of that only continue to grow as you took the harvest of that education and have served as a pastor, both in New York City and also in Chico, California, and as a professor also during your time in Chico. And so as you were doing that work full-time, then you started adding other ingredients of faith and science research and partnership through Templeton and otherwise. Tell us about that chapter, because that the richness of what you did there is is all part of this grand effort that has, I think, now come together in such a wonderful way in your current position.
So part of being at the GTU during those years, so that was the mid 90s, was that in the Human Genome Initiative, Francis Collins, I think it was he who did this, but at least in the initiative itself, there was a percentage given to ethical and theological or religious reflection on the effect of the human genome. And the GTU was part of that reflection. So I wasn't specifically involved in the project, but I got to hear people like Ted and Bob, who I mentioned earlier, and others bring theological weight to what was happening with decoding the entire, 3 billion base pairs of the human genome, which is amazing. And as I've gone back to notes, I realized that one of my first encounters with the Templeton world was through an organization they funded called Metanexus. And I began to do that actually already in my PhD program, began to see that there were people who were willing to put money into this interaction of, in this case, more science and faith, science and religion. And I began to see that unfold. I did get to New York, as you mentioned, with my first pastorate there at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian. And through that, I began to then get involved with people at the John Templeton Foundation. They were really interested in the fact that there was this pastor with a PhD in theology and science who was doing adult ed, in that world. And so that got me into conversations with one of their, I think grant officers is the right title, Paul Wasson, who's fabulous. And then his associate, Drew Rick Miller, who's been an ongoing colleague. And that led then to two larger projects, $2 million projects each, both 3 years, Scientists and Congregations and Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries, which both in different modes brought together a religious leader, generally a pastor, and a professional in science in that pastor's congregation to see what it would look like to bring these two realms of human life and inquiry together, and then to, in some ways, bring that learning to the congregation. And that was what got me into the Templeton world. I'll just say one thing, if I may, on that. I love the fact that, to the best of my knowledge, the second grant, I think it was, came to Bidwell Presbyterian Church. No, sorry, the first grant, Scientists and Congregations. I think it was the first grant that ever was given to a church by the John Templeton Foundation, this $4 billion, $5 billion organization. So I felt a real joy about that. And then the fact that my friend and colleague there, Dave Navarra, got the $1 million check, literally a check in the mail, and brought it to, our account person at the church. So some fun parts to all this, but it began this journey with Templeton and others.
Right. I think for anyone who's been grant funded to suddenly have checks of that size arrive on your doorstep is pretty breathtaking. So thanks for that little remembrance. So that work that you do takes many different forms. That's not the main subject of our conversation today, but it from my point of view, it layered into your life all kinds of knowledge of organizations and grant receiving and grant administering work. But much more substantial than that was the actual intellectual work exposure, the rigor of your own work, other people that were professional collaborators, but also congregations and Christians in all kinds of settings grappling with the same realities that are being talked about, just with different playbooks in their own knowledge and education and background, but sharing in a way much of the common problems. And one of the things about this new position that you have is that it's that again, where people come at it, as we all are right now, through the lens of AI, with endlessly different capacities, knowledge bases, awareness, information, etc. And yet we are all sharing, arguably, one of the most consequential moments in history, in which something that we only think we somewhat understand and somewhat anticipate, with both titillating interest and sometimes great fear, the full onset, build out, impact of something called artificial intelligence. I want to read what I've heard you say is your job. This is way of you describing it. And then I'd like you to give us a little history on AI and faith, how it was formed, and the moment that the organization is now in. You write, as executive director of AI and faith, I'm guiding an organization dedicated to bringing the wisdom of the world's great religions into the conversations about AI's moral and ethical challenges. That work keeps me constantly aware that AI is not simply a technical project. It is an expression of human hopes and fears, our longings for power, our craving for convenience, and our hunger for transcendence and meaning. In that sense, every AI model carries an implicit anthropology and an embedded moral vision, whether or not its designers name it. That is a tremendous vision and a remarkable job to have laid upon you. So give us a background about AI and Faith as an organization, which you've recently joined and are its first executive director. And then tell us about the chapter that you're now set to lead.
Those words came out of some deep reflection, and they've been reworked a few times. So having you read them reminds me of, just what we are facing. And that isn't only a negative when I say that, but what we have to steward as Christians, I'll say it more positively, this emergence of AI, which, as you said, may be the most powerful technology ever created. So AI and Faith had amazing foresight. It was co-started by Thomas Osborne and David Brenner in the Seattle area. And Thomas is in the world of computing, and right now is part of an AI company that he's developing. And then David has been an attorney and very interested in the part of the world that connects with technology. Let's say it really simply. So they said, this technology is emerging. We live in Seattle, in this area where there's Amazon and there's Microsoft, and we need to respond to this in some ways, and respond to it in ways that can show that AI can be both safe and beneficial. So one of the things that they've done, which I have, it's been a gift to me, literally a gift. I did nothing to create this. When I started the job in October 1st of 2025, was that they, among other things, brought this amazing network. So we have 220 experts in 20 countries partnering with 34 or other organizations. And, it's just astounding to hear the kinds of people that are part of that. So they brought this network, they brought these connections, they brought, in many ways, conversations about AI and faith and how they could come together in just a multiplicity of ways. The main thing we're doing is we're seeking to bring the insights, religious and theological insights and ethics to this conversation. So obviously in the last 7-8 years, that conversation has changed a great deal. And part of that, I think, is the emergence of AI for many of us, which I think you saw this draft of this book I'm working on, an AI made for us, which I hope will be out soon after this podcast is recorded. And, in that I mentioned when ChatGPT came out, that we really took in November of 2022, and we all saw this thing that could write essays, it could give us recipes, it could tell us how to work out if we wanted to run a marathon, it could tell us where to go in the Napa Valley, and even a host of other things. And all of a sudden we saw, most of us, something that was very different from what had happened before. And the reason I'm mentioning that is this was 4 years after David and Thomas had created this organization. So a lot of things had occurred. Today, of course, we are in the midst of something that's really obviously on many people's minds and on many people's hearts as to what we're going to do with AI. It's now part of our military, which we've seen some major events recently come about in relationship to that. It's part of our relationships. A third of teenagers say they prefer to have a relationship with a chatbot. It's part of the way we do education. So, as a university lecturer, I saw that. I used it at times. I saw my students use it, sometimes telling me they'd used it and sometimes not. But it's definitely unfolded a great deal in those 8 years. And so I'm really thankful for the foresight and now to steward this organization, it is breathtaking, truly breathtaking. And I mean that in the way of breathtaking that is partly I'm just trying to run to keep up with this train of this emerging AI. And then secondly, it's breathtaking, kind of like falling in love. It's like there's so much beauty and excitement that I often feel about what I see happening. Mark, I just want to say one other piece, just to make sure for the listeners it's clear, is that this is a interfaith, multi-religious organization, and part of that was the vision of David and Thomas to say, we want this to be we, meaning as we come to this, we want to partner with other religions to have a common voice with the development and the refining of AI. So we do have partnerships with among various religious traditions.
Right. And that is, I think, one of your distinctives and one of the particular gifts that you bring. What do you think was the intuition behind that? I can think of all sorts of reasons that would justify it, but I'm just curious what you've heard about why that seemed like the right thing to do.
I think it was that two things that I've discerned and two things that have come out. One is that there's a lot more that we can agree on among religious traditions and in terms of ethics that would be really important to bring to this moment, or a lot that we can't agree on. I shouldn't say more there. There's just many, many ethical claims, such as the value of humanity, the value of compassion, the value of creation or nature, or however we call it, is something that's really significant. And of course, as a follower of Christ, all those things resonate a great deal. And the idea of human flourishing is another, word or phrase that we're often bringing up, or to quote Irenaeus, the human being fully alive is such a key element. So partly, I think it's just, we have a lot that we can share, and let's come together. Partly also because there's so much polarization and so much division. The second part is that you might say strategically, if that's used in the richest sense of the word, we have a lot better engagement with the actual companies themselves if we come with a voice of various religions. So as we're recording this, I've been invited to be part of some work in giving Anthropic feedback on the Claude Constitution and other things and other parts of their work. And they contacted us, that is AI and Faith, my research director, Mark Graves, and me, because of our interfaith, interreligious constitution, or the way we're put together. So it validates that, and I think it's something they particularly Anthropic is really looking forward to. But it's been replicated in the other engagement with people in the AI world, and so I think it's been a good approach and a useful approach, and one that I think will have a lot of traction with people.
Well, I do think there's also a sense that AI is going to be almost like being the injection of a new kind of atmosphere that will not have the boundaries of any particular kind that are going to keep it boxed in. And therefore, if it's going to influence the whole world, it should be the whole world's religions that in some serious sense take this moment of change and discovery, development with seriousness, and bring the wisdom tradition, which each of the major religions of the world certainly have a depth of understanding and of contribution to make. So it's an amazing thing, and such good instincts. I think it's part of other instincts that the founders of AI and Faith had about trying to do this in a thoughtful, capacious, appreciative, and critical way, all at one time. So in this convergence that you capture, I think beautifully in that paragraph that I read, you open it by saying an organization dedicated to bringing the wisdom of the world's great religions into the conversations about AI's moral and ethical challenges. So you're now the first time they've had an executive director. Chapter 2 of AI and Faith as an organization is underway. You've been in this job for a number of months. All kinds of good things have been happening. And you're very aware that you're on a kind of threshold of figuring out how do you actually do a sentence that is as gargantuan as that sentence of bringing the wisdom of the world's great religions into conversations about AI's moral and ethical challenges? Give us just an overview of what that even refers to. I could think of a million things it could refer to, but it's not a million things. So give us a glimpse into what that actually translates into as it's developed so far.
I will say that the title of my dissertation is God and the World.
Well, there
or
we
at
have.
least in there. And in German, when you say, we were talking about everything and nothing, you say we were talking about God and the world. So Laura always likes to say, you like to think big thoughts, Greg. That's who you are. So, and to use one more image, it is definitely a David and Goliath world. Right now, AI and Faith is about a $500,000 a year organization. And the number I hear being bandied about is somewhere near $500 billion is going to be poured into AI in this first half of 2026. So what are the ethical challenges? That's the question. To get back to that is, first of all, I think the ethical challenge is, will we treat human beings with dignity and grace? And will we move toward human flourishing as this powerful technology continues to emerge? So that's an ethical question that the world's wisdom, the world's religious wisdom brings a lot to. And of course, our commitment to the wisdom of Scripture, that there's this, for us particularly, and within the monotheistic tradition, that we are created in the image of God. And how do we give dignity to that? How do we sustain the dignity of all people? So that goes then into, the ethics of, let's say, the distribution of the goods of AI, or also the input into AI. So probably most people know that AI models are trained on a huge amount of data. A gazillion times gazillion amount of data. And, AI models are trained. They're not programmed. So it's like training maybe an animal. You give it certain things that you want it to do, but it does that in ways that are not entirely predictable. In the language of AI, that's stochastic. So why am I bringing that up? Because the models are trained on data that's available primarily on the internet. And there are between 2 and 2.5 billion people, I'm told, who are not on the internet. And so the question is, are they represented? And of course, the answer is no, they're not represented. So that's one element of human dignity. The second one then would be, even those traditions that have a lot of literature on the internet or other things, are they well represented? So there are 600 million people that speak Arabic in the world, and only 0.06% of AI models are trained on Arabic sources. So we have a representation issue as well, back to human dignity. We also have the issues of, a lot of the models are trained by human labor, or have been in the past almost entirely, and that can be done to exploit human labor in developing countries. We have the ethic. I'm going negative here, but let's just go there for a bit in terms of the use of water. And water is necessary because the processing units are so hot, as it were. They have to be cooled with water currently. Although I'll just put it in there that one of my friend's sons is working on better, more energy efficient cooling systems for AI data centers. But anyway, currently it's potable water, so drinkable water is being used. Energy usage, because these are, again, multiple GPUs that are being processing this information, just use incredible amounts of energy. So we've got human dignity, we've got the care for creation. We also, have within the ethics of, how do we understand humanity in the light of AI? And there's been this side of the development of artificial intelligence that goes back to the beginning, back to the 50s and 60s, where it was, AI is going to go so far beyond us, we're going to become less and less important. And maybe just kind of like, meat puppets or something, like the real action is going to be in the silicon. We're just going to be these, playthings perhaps for super intelligent AI. And, that's another human dignity issue. Are we defined by knowledge? And I would say, no, the image of God is not fundamentally about knowledge. Are we going to create these systems so that we care for human beings and not, somehow privilege them so highly that we don't take into account what they mean for how we understand the human world? So those are a few of the issues that we're part of, and there are a number of others, of course.
And even if knowledge isn't the most important thing, it can be the most powerful thing. Mm-hmm. And so you could still have this convergence of claiming, on the one hand, the value of human dignity, but having a battle to fight over whether having the power of knowledge is going to win, even if one side has greater dignity. So, I mean, there's an endless morass of these kinds of debates and definitions that are going to have to be worked out and are being worked on. And I'm very, very glad that AI and Faith is taking those things seriously and has a team of people around the world already deeply engaged in this kind of reflection. I was in a context within the last year with somebody who works at one of the truly major tech companies in a very, very senior role, in a conversation where an ethical question was raised. And this senior team of people in this company looked at each other and were honest enough in that room to say, none of us has any training in ethics. We know actually nothing about how to think ethically. Mm-hmm. We know how to, in general, think about something abstractly called the good or the better, nothing to do with the best. And in any case, we wouldn't be able to translate how that intuition can actually be meaningfully brought to technical decisions about the ethics of AI. This really caused, in this case, a crisis, and the team did a number of things almost immediately to just simply educate themselves, and in a way that hyper technology and quantums of money can accomplish. They were given, a fast track class, as it were, on ethics and moral knowledge, and they are now better equipped. But when I went back to my friend after this crisis had occurred, and I said, what has happened, and she gave me the update, it was still very troubling to me to think that people at such a senior level had no capacity to do something that, from a Christian point of view or from a religious point of view, had such primary claim on the importance of the things that were being done. And yet no one in the room had any real training in that kind of knowing, partly because it's been denied to be real knowledge. So there's lots of debates that go on. How do you think, if you zero in for just a minute on that, does your sense of the work of AI and Faith have to do with educating, as it were, the common person about these things? Or is your strategy principally about how do you educate the technology leaders and decision makers about ethics and technology?
I think we have, let me say first, before I answer that directly, that one of the consultations I'm part of is convened by the American Securities Foundation, and it's an interreligious organization. And one of the stories I also heard was, as the leaders of that group, this interreligious group, have come to places like OpenAI and Amazon, the leaders, I think even at the C-suite level, if not the higher level management, have said, there's questions that are emerging from AI that we can't answer, and they're actually soliciting help, from this group to give input. So, and I think, as we give more to AI, in other words, as we look for more from our queries, we'll probably be facing this more, and the companies will be wise to engage people who understand religion and philosophy. We really have three publics, and we've been talking a lot about that expert public, especially in the industry, which we have, and we also have people in education, in computer science and theology and religion and anthropology, on and on. So some really amazing experts. That was that first number I looked at or talked about a few minutes ago. The second level is the level of, it's not a level really. The next public I would think of is the religious leaders and the congregations, as it were. So, and this is actually because of my own experience in bringing science to the church in my pastoral work. I've had a lot of experience with, and I have a lot of care and love for that, that component of our work, that public. So we're also really trying to affect, congregations. And we have a couple of grants that we're working on, a couple of projects that are grant funded. One is with mosques and non-denominational churches, bringing religious training curriculum to help find a way toward safe and beneficial AI. And then we're also connecting, of course, therefore, with the leaders. And there's another grant we have that's partnering with a Presbyterian Synod, one of the larger bodies. You know this well, but just to say, if someone doesn't, and it's funded by OpenAI to help, again, with the same kind of thing. How do we use AI safely and beneficially? Because we don't want these terrible scenarios in which a teenager or young adult, or anybody is having an ongoing, counseling with an AI model and then being brought into self-harm, for example. That's one of the most notorious uses of that. So that's the second public. The third one is the larger public. And we have thankfully had a lot of, if I may say, success with that. The New York Times did a piece on AI and that really featured AI and faith a few years ago. They're talking about writing an update on that. And, it seems to me, if I can be just a little bit salty, that we have a lot of people that are noising about AI. And AI and faith and other partner organizations have great people to bring insights to that. And we want to make sure that comes out and comes forward. And as you know, I believe that as Christians, we need to steward this like we've stewarded a lot of other technological breakthroughs. The Codex, the book, was the first century that was brought forward. That was such an important part of actually the creation of the Bible as we know it, the printing press, internet, etc. And in a world in which it's about 5-1 that people are pessimistic about AI over people who are optimistic. In other words, 5 more people feel like AI is a threat and a problem than it's a promise. We want to be part of, helping the public, and then particularly the religious religious part of our, of the United States and the world, really understand how AI can be something that is made for us, that we can make it for us if we use it properly.
Which suggests that the ordinary person has some degree of agency in relationship to AI. And I would say that one of the broad reasons for such concern and fear about AI is a feeling that there is no human agency. So to unpack even the paragraph or the sentence that you just spoke, that somehow we can use it in such a way that it will be more positive, those are words that have to themselves be defined and explained. So let's not go further before you actually give us some rudimentary explanation of what that means.
That's really important, and I've focused, and again, on this piece that I sent to you, in AI made for us, that we can make a difference in how AI is used from the subjective side. And I believe our traditions as Christians, theologically and spiritually, make a big difference. So let me just say one thing about that title. So I'm riffing on Jesus's words about the Sabbath, that the Sabbath, we weren't made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for us. Same thing is true of AI, that we can create and make and shape AI so it'll be truly made for us and support what's good in human flourishing. So part of that, I think, is just simply knowing that we have agency over our use of AI. We can't change the way it's trained, most of us, although AI and faith is trying to do that, trying to help there to be more accurate religious knowledge, for example, trying to make sure that there's safeguards so that a chatbot that's in a conversation with you will say, I'm a chatbot, I'm not a counselor, that sort of thing. So that's one part, but also that's what we're doing. But as a user, how do we bring our spiritual traditions like Sabbath, to say, we can shut this off. We can disengage. We don't need to be defined by our engagement with AI. I think another part of that is, understanding that we are created for relationships, and those, to the best of my understanding by social scientific research, is real face-to-face human relationships. We of course can have virtual relationships, but the work that's coming out of this massive Harvard Human Flourishing Project that correlates religion with human flourishing, that has told us that the most important thing is worship in person. That is the most important religious connection with growing and human flourishing. And so that would then indicate that we need to have real human relationships, small groups, compassionate service toward one another, worship together, movement together, all those things that, sacraments together, all those things that have been part of the Christian church. So in this part, I just sound really almost retrograde or something, or repristinating the past, but I believe there's a lot of wisdom here. Every time we've thought we could move out of these things, the scripture tells us, no, we need to move back to them, back to community and being together in, koinonia, in fellowship. So that's a couple of the ways that I could see positively helping AI to be something that supports us and serves us. And probably just always asking the question, is this use of AI helping me to flourish and helping the people I'm around to flourish, or is it taking away that human flourishing? If it's the second answer, put it aside. If it's the first answer, it's yes, use it as a tool, as something that can guide us into a better life.
The tricky part, as you know, is that human beings have a capacity to work so imaginatively that the lines blur very readily between fiction and reality, just period, right? I mean, regardless of the topic that has nothing to do with AI, it just has to do with the way we function, even in the world of middle-sized objects where ordinary things exist and have their being. And we can certainly fantasize in that world. How much more easily might we fantasize in an AI world? So I'm not actually arguing against what you're saying in potential. I'm just sobered by the fact that these boundaries are going to have to be, as they almost always are, humanly willed in order for them to be maintained, right? I mean, I suppose there could come a way in which we could yield our personal discipline to a machine to help us just automatically shut itself off after a certain period of time, or so forth. I mean, I remember on the place of the retrograde, I when our kids were growing up and we would, sequentially purchase another computer in another era with another set of software, and then we'd have these carcasses of various, pieces that at the time we bought them, we thought they seemed so unbelievably beautiful and fast and superior to the previous technology. But as they in turn faded, they just became this really ugly piece of used machinery that had lost its scintillating, almost at times mystical quality. Mm-hmm. And it was just back to being a dead piece of hardware by the side of the road, as it were. And then you'd go outside and you'd look at an old tree, but you were never prone to say, what a stupid old tree. I want a new tree. I want a new sky. I just don't like this sky anymore. I want a new sky. We don't do those things, of course. And we don't do them because of what I think you're getting at, that there are ingredients so fundamental to our humanity and our sense of what being alive means, that being in an old growth forest, looking at a sky in all of its various forms and times and seasons is an act of wonder and soulish nourishment that is not the same as just bringing on the next piece of technology or even the next bot, which will do its own magic tricks. Is that part of what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think that's right. And obviously beautifully said. I do not underestimate human depravity, that we are, as a person in the Reformed Calvinist tradition, I've already mentioned how the AI models themselves are trained on data, which is privileged toward the powerful, and that's part of human depravity. But also ourselves, we're going to seek things that aren't good for us. So the unit of measure that I would put out there is something that's different for us as Americans. It's not the individual. It really is the community. And I as a pastor, and this as a pastor, the church is not perfect, but I think we have a unit of measure as community, either small group or slightly larger small group, that actually can help us make good decisions if we embed it in our practices because we can hold each other accountable. And it's the basis of why Alcoholics Anonymous works, right? I mean, is that we see other people around us that are doing the same thing. We realize they're not superhuman, and we can do that. I would also say that there's two more pieces. We've already mentioned wisdom. I think we can embed the slow wisdom that resists the rapidity of technology. And so that's really critical. We've always known as Christians that we need to reflect and take time with God and pray and meditate. And that's going to be something that will, if that's a fundamental practice, we'll realize when that's being taken away from us. But also, I think hope is really important. I think hope, in my estimation, is taking steps today for a vision of tomorrow that you want to see occur. And that is what makes positive change in us as human beings and positive change in the world around us. And it's such a critical element of the Christian faith, of course.
One of the things that I read about this week that I think is an example of what you're describing is the way that AI is being used to help develop medicines for extremely rare diseases. And where AI has a capacity to do that without the longevity of time that developing medicines for rare diseases of small population groups might take literally decades, and where AI can speed all that up in certain ways for a much shorter period of time, and theoretically at least, for the positive medical impact. And the benefits of medicine and AI, while again open to abuse, are also open to tremendous breakthroughs and understanding things that we didn't even understand about the universe. I mean, even again, this last week, I read an article about AI and the dating of the universe and understanding certain things about galaxies, which we really thought we had seen and understood more or less correctly. And suddenly another breakthrough happens, and it's all been, in a matter of very short period of time, completely recalibrated because of something that is now considered part of the knowledge base from which further reflections about the universe can occur. I mean, Greg, I feel like this is an intoxicating job, and that it's an intoxicating task to be given this remarkable opportunity to lead AI and faith. And I am sure that we will have you back for future conversations as this work develops. You're only a short number of months into your new role. You've written this short book that's going to be coming out hopefully very soon on, how to say it again, AI made for us.
AI made for us, yeah.
An AI made for us.
Yeah.
And so I encourage people to know about that. And if there's a link we can put in the notes, we will do that. And the ongoing monitoring of this development, which no one can really keep track of because it's all moving so fast, and that's all part of its attraction and part of its addiction, it really matters. And I couldn't be more grateful that in the providence of God that you should be a person right in the vortex of these concerns from a religious and specifically from a Christian point of view. So thank you for your harvesting of a rich past that you can now apply in this wonderful new season. May God bless AI and faith in every way. Thank you for being a guest today.
Thank you for this conversation.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.